Bigg City Engines. Written and told by Kiefer Adams. Long ago, on the island of Sodor, there lived a little tank engine named Marklin. His job in those days was to be the station pilot at Knapford. After Thomas arrived on the island of Sodor, Marklin felt he was being used less and less. He eventually told the engines that this was due to being homesick and he wanted to return to his old railway. The Fat Controller completely understood. By this point, he had enough engines to run on his railway, so Marklin was able to return home. But of course, Edward, who had deep sympathy for Marklin, knew exactly where he had come from to begin with. Marklin's old railway was none other than the Bigg City Port, home of Captain Starr and Captain Zero's tugs. Thomas had visited the port not too long ago and had helped to stop the notorious criminal Johnny Cuba from causing trouble. Marklin was now known as Puffa after a recent overhaul. He now had a cowcatcher, a dark grey coat of paint, a headlamp and a large stack or funnel, which was how he got his name due to the smoke that it emitted. Marklin did not work on the dock railway of the Bigg City Port alone. He shared it with a little dock tank engine called Little Owl. She was a very kind and supportive engine, and had worked at the port while Puffa had worked on the Fat Controller's railway. The two engines are the best of friends and support each other no matter what. Even before Thomas's visit to the Bigg City Port, they had their own adventures. Puffa had raced against some logs when they had broken away, and Little Owl had been saved by a garbage barge when one of the railroad bridges had collapsed. But little did the two engines know that very soon their help would be required on a certain railway that Puffa had worked on long ago. One bright and early morning on the island of Sodor, Thomas was surprised when his driver arrived a lot earlier than usual. "What time is it?" he yawned. "Time for a surprise," said Thomas's driver. "The Fat Controller's waiting for us at the harbour on Edward's branch line." "Surprise?" said Thomas. But my fire isn't warm yet." "We'll take care of that," said his fireman, who had also just arrived to start work. Thomas was confused. "I'm not supposed to be at the harbour today," he said. "I've got my branch line train." "Percy can look after that," said his driver. "The Fat Controller says that this is urgent." Thomas didn't need to argue with that. If it was an emergency at the harbour, then he must attend. Before long, Thomas's fire was burning brightly, and he set off to Brendam Harbour. At first, when Thomas arrived, there was no one to greet him. The Fat Controller, however, had just arrived in his car. "Ah, Thomas," he said, "perfect timing. I'd like you to show our guests around Sodor. One of them knows our rails all too well, but he might need a bit of reminding." "Guests?" asked Thomas. Before the Fat Controller could reply, two loud and booming whistles echoed in the distance. Thomas recognised them at once. "I don't believe it," he exclaimed. "Puffa! Thomas! Little Owl! Hiya, pet! How you keeping?" "It's so good to see you both," said Thomas. "But what are you doing here?" "Work on my railway has gotten a bit too much since the winter season," said the Fat Controller. "The dock railway at the Bigg City Port have kindly offered us Puffa and Little Owl to help out for a couple of weeks. I'm sure many would like to welcome Puffa back to Sodor and make Little Owl feel welcome." "Oh, yes, sir, of course," said Thomas. "You can count on me." "Thank you, Thomas," said the Fat Controller. He turned to Puffa. "It's good to have you back, Marklin," he said with a knowing wink. He turned and walked away. "Well, come on then, pet," said Little Owl with excitement. "I'm ready to start work." "So am I," said Puffa. "It's good to be back." Soon, the two dockyard engines were put to work. Many of the Fat Controller's engines couldn't believe how happier Puffa was, since they knew him as Marklin not too long ago. Even Gordon was impressed. "You look so much healthier and happier, my dear engine," he said when he and Percy got to see Puffa. "I feel it," he said. "Thanks to Little Owl, I've never felt this amazing in a long time." "Is it true that Thomas stopped a tramp steamer when he was at the Bigg City Port?" asked Percy. "Oh, yes, indeed," replied Puffa. "But even before he came to see us, Little Owl and myself have had our own adventures. I'll tell you about them sometime." Percy was pleased to hear this. There was nothing that either Puffa or Little Owl couldn't tackle. The trucks were on their best behaviour, the coaches followed suit when they were shunted into their proper sidings, and many of the engines, especially the likes of James and Henry, had to admit that having Puffa back was a wonderful experience, and they all made Little Owl especially welcome. She had always been keen to see what Sodor was like, having heard the stories from Puffa himself. That evening, Thomas was being fired up for his evening train. He was almost ready to go when Toby bustled in. "I tell you what, Thomas," said Toby, "those dockyard engines are incredible. Is it true that Puffa, is it, used to work here?" "That's right," said Thomas. "He used to be called Marklin. He told me this incredible story when I was at the Bigg City Port." "What do you mean?" asked Toby. "Well," said Thomas, "Puffa told me about this naval tug who had gotten careless with a ship called the Krakatoa. There was an explosion all across the harbour. The other tugs had to get Puffa out of there." "Incredible," said Toby. "Puffa also said because of this he was quite jumpy with fires and explosions," said Thomas. "I don't blame him, but he was so brave getting out of there when he could." "I can imagine," said Toby. "I hope we don't get anything like that while he's here." "So do I," said Thomas. "Well, I best be going." And Thomas puffed away, leaving Toby at a loss for words of how incredible Puffa's life must be at the Bigg City Port. It wasn't just Toby who was impressed. When Edward returned, James and Gordon were talking about Puffa non-stop. "I can't believe he looks so much better," said James. "Gordon was just telling me all about it. You'd hardly recognise him if he came to Sodor the first time." "I know," agreed Edward. "He seems so much good about himself now, and that's wonderful to hear." "I never thought a pair of engines like them would be so well-mannered," said Duck. "I'm so glad to have finally met them." "They've come a long way," said Gordon, "especially Puffa. I'll admit, some of us weren't too kind with him when he used to be called Marklin." "But after what he's done," said James, "it's incredible how much hard working he is." "That I agree with," said Edward. The engines talked of nothing but Puffa and Little Owl all night long. But there was going to be a challenge ahead of the two engines that they would least expect. Most of the Fat Controller's engines were working late well into the night. Puffa and Little Owl were at a small yard on the other side of the island. Thomas had his evening train, and Henry was pulling a late-night suburban train. All was going well, and Henry was pleased to not be pulling the flying kipper for a change. He had just passed Crosby Station when he saw smoke billowing over some hedges up ahead. "Steady on, Henry," said his driver, as the big green engine tried to pick up speed. "We're not racing anyone." "Fire!" shouted Henry, and his eyes pointed to the flames ahead. "We must alert someone immediately." Henry braked hard and backed up to the next station. His driver alerted the station master. "Percy's working near the harbour tonight," he said. "I'll give him a call so he can alert Harold." Percy was just marshalling the last of his trucks when the call came in. His driver came back rather frantic. "There's a fire near the yards of Crosby," he said. "We must alert Harold the helicopter at once. He can help to assist with putting it out." "What about the fire brigade?" asked Percy. "We'll sort that out once we've alerted Harold," said his driver. Percy wasted no time. He hurried under the bridge past the harbour and found Harold. "Harold!" Percy cried. "We've got an emergency!" And he explained everything. "I'd like to help, old chap," said Harold, "but unfortunately the fuel truck didn't come today. I can't be topped up until morning." "But there's a fire, Harold," wailed Percy. "I know that, old boy, and I'm deeply sorry," said Harold. Percy was frantic. He thanked Harold at least and set off up the line to find help. The bad news kept on coming. A station master in a small country yard had been informed about the fire. He had also been informed that the fire brigade was unable to attend. Just as he hung up the telephone, there was the sound of an engine in the distance. The station master grabbed his red flag and went to stop the engine approaching. It was Little Owl. She had just made a delivery to the other side of the island. "Stop!" cried the station master. "We need your help!" Little Owl came into view and screeched to a halt. "What's up, Doc?" she asked. "There's a fire near the yards of Crosby," said the station master. "Unfortunately, there's no way of getting to it." Little Owl had an idea. "Don't worry about a thing, sir," she said. "I'll take care of it. Me and an old friend know just what to do." She pumped her pistons, blasted her whistle, and set off to the yards that she and Puffa were working at. Little Owl was familiar with fire strategies, and she knew just what to do. In the small yard not too far away, Puffa was just finishing off his work. Little Owl, whistling almost fit to burst, came scampering into the yards. "Puffa!" she cried. "We need a tanker filled with water and some hoses." "Whatever for?" asked Puffa, and Little Owl was quick to explain. Puffa was nervous. I'd like to help," he stuttered, "but the whole munitions incident—" "Never mind that," interrupted Little Owl. "We're the only engines who know what to do in this situation. We've got to help. Otherwise the Fat Controller's railway can't run properly tomorrow." "Well, when you put it like that," said Puffa, "we must help." Puffa frantically searched the yard and was lucky to find an empty cream tanker nearby. It was quickly filled to the brim with water. Little Owl's crew were given pumps and hoses. Puffa and Little Owl were soon coupled up and they charged up the line to the rescue. Thomas was making his way home from his last train of the day. He was looking forward to hearing more stories from Puffa about the Bigg City Port and wondered if anyone would still remember how he helped in the arrest of Johnny Cuba. His thoughts were dashed when he reached a signal box. "Sorry, Thomas," said the signalman. "An emergency train needs to come through. There's a fire near Crosby." "A fire?" gasped Thomas. "We should go and help." But before Thomas could make a move, two loud booming whistles echoed in the distance, and before long Puffa and Little Owl charged on by. Puffa was even wearing warning flags across his cowcatcher. "Step aside, Thomas," he shouted. "Rescue engines coming through," called Little Owl, and they were gone as soon as they arrived. Thomas couldn't believe his eyes. "Go on, you two," he cried, and he hurried back to the yards to let the others know that everything was under control. The fire had already begun to spread by the time Puffa and Little Owl arrived. They immediately jumped onto the scene. Puffa guided the tanker to where it was needed, and the workmen were given the pumps and hoses from Little Owl's crew. They wasted no time, and soon they were working hard to try and put out the fire. Any people that were stranded or trapped within the flames, Little Owl was quick to hurry to their rescue. She found a truck in the corner of the yard and was soon evacuating all the workmen who couldn't get out. Puffa was nervous. The munitions incident started to flood back into his smoke box, but he knew this was not a time to be afraid. "I can do it," he gasped. Puffa raced backwards and forwards, and with Little Owl's help, the fire was soon under control. Dawn was just starting to break when the last flame was put out. The workmen cheered, and a tired but grubby Puffa and Little Owl were satisfied that they had saved the day, or in this case, the night. Early the next morning, Little Owl and Puffa were being cleaned at a small station halt. They were surprised when Thomas arrived with Annie and Clarabel. "Thomas!" Puffa exclaimed. "What are you doing here, pet?" Little Owl asked. "Someone would like to see you," said Thomas. The Fat Controller stepped out of Annie and approached the two dockyard engines. "Well done to you both," he congratulated. "That was the quickest thinking and bravery I have ever seen on the island of Sodor." "Thank you, sir," said Little Owl. "We had a bit of practice at the port," said Puffa. The Fat Controller was pleased. "I've just contacted your owner. He will be giving you both a new coat of paint and new propositions in the harbour." "Thank you, sir," said Puffa. "Always happy to help," smiled Little Owl. The Fat Controller turned to Puffa. "You have done so well since you were part of my railway," he said. "I am very proud of the pair of you. Well done." The Fat Controller tipped his hat and returned to Annie. "Good for you two," said Thomas. "Well done." As Thomas puffed away, Little Owl and Puffa were gathered in their thoughts. They knew they had a couple of weeks before they headed back to the Bigg City Port. But when they did, they couldn't wait to tell the Starr tugs about their bravery on the Island of Sodor, where Puffa's journey had begun all those years ago.